Okay, welcome everyone. This is a meeting of the HPC, and we welcome and really are thrilled that you came out on this dark, cold night to listen to this. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kathleen Bennett. I'm the chairperson of the HPC. We are a volunteer group appointed by the mayor, who meets in this very room once a month and looks at applications that come before us from either the planning board or the zoning board or for certificate of appropriateness. I have 5 fellow commissioners. Nobody was able to come tonight, but we'll be here next week for a meeting, I think. So I'd like to introduce, before we go further, I'd like to introduce Graham Peto. Graham Peto is the assistant planner in the Township of Montclair. He works in the planning department upstairs, and he is really an integral member of our team. If we didn't have him in the planning office, we wouldn't be able to do anything. So thank you, Graham.
Sure.
On tap, we also have Margot Hickey, who is a principal of Hickey and Conley Historic Preservation Architects. And she's the person who actually wrote the report. The 2 reports, copies of the reports, are on the front table up here, and we also have information that you're more than welcome to take away with you tonight. And if you need anything else, we can certainly get to you. We do ask that you sign in. There's a sign-in sheet in the back. If you can sign in, and perhaps with your contact information, so that if there's any areas of concern that we hear tonight, one of us would be able to get back to you about it. So without further ado, tonight what we're going to do is Graham is going to give a little introduction about the methodology and the time frame and really what this is all about. And then Margaret will present her report with a PowerPoint. I think it'll take about 20 minutes. And then we're going to open it up for questions and or concerns. I don't think we have a podium, though. We can pull this over. So
and we also have a cordless mic that we can pass around the audience, so you guys can
so
stay in your
maybe
seats.
we'll just have everybody sit.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Graham,
Sure.
I'm going to turn it over to you.
So as Chair Bennett mentioned, my name is Graham Peto. I'm the assistant planner here with Montclair Township up in the Department of Planning and Community Development. Just want to welcome everybody out to our community meeting this evening to talk through this process that we're engaging in. The beginning of this began back, the Historic Preservation Commission and the Planning Board worked together collaboratively to develop a new master plan to guide historic preservation in the township in November of 2016. That plan was adopted. As part of that plan exercise, the Commission and its consultant to help complete the plan did an extensive look at the township's historic resources to identify potential historic resources that could be preserved here within Montclair. As part of that exercise, the 2 districts that we are discussing this evening were identified as important, potentially important historic resource areas that warranted further survey and study. Moving forward in 2018, the township applied for a certified local government grant and aid application to conduct a historic resource survey, to a more in-depth look at those 2 areas, Oakcroft and Wheeler Street. The township was successful in being awarded just under $25,000 from the state, and the township used that money to retain Connolly and Hickey, Ms. Margaret Hickey, who's here this evening, to conduct the more in-depth survey of these areas, and that's what the maps in the back depict. There's also 2 copies, one of each of the areas up here at the front of the room. We also are maintaining copies of the full nomination proposals in our office upstairs on the 2nd floor, in the clerk's office, and also on the website. So we have them posted far and wide. We have also set up a website for outreach and information on this entire process. It's montclairnjusa.org/Oakcroft-Wheeler. We'll be posting tonight's presentation on that website, as well as a video link to tonight's meeting, as we're being broadcast live on TV 34 and also live streamed on YouTube. Moving forward, the Commission has scheduled the formal public hearing for the nomination of these 2 districts at their meeting on December 10th. And it's at that meeting that formal public comments will be accepted, as well as any comments registering opposition to the proposed districting can be registered with the commission at that time. There's links and, of course, information all associated on the Oakcroft Wheeler webpage that I mentioned earlier that explain that entire process for members of the public. And just as always, we here at staff level, I serve as the staff support to the commission. We're here to assist you, residents. So if you have any questions throughout the process, my contact information is available on the website. Feel free to give me a call, send me an email. I'm happy to reach out and explain any details, questions, or anything that you need through this process. I do just want to mention that the HPC is one part of this process. Designation is a lengthy process. Subsequent to this, there will be a referral to the council. The council will then send it to the planning board for review, for advisory input, and then it goes back to the council, and the council is the ultimate decider to approve, modify, or deny the proposed designation of these districts. So lots more to come on all that stuff as we discuss and move forward, and any questions I can clarify at the end of this evening. But now I want to turn it over to Ms. Margot Hickey, our consultant, who will lead us through her survey work that she's completed.
Historic preservation specialist with Connolly and Hickey Historical Architects. I'm also a registered architect, but my hat is really in the historic preservation mode. And our firm was contracted with the township to study two rather distinct historic districts. My notes. Thank you. So the one is the Wheeler Street district, which is located, and I will get the directions wrong at some point, west of Bloomfield Avenue, actually near the border of Glen Ridge, along Woodland Avenue, and then the other is in Upper Montclair, immediately adjacent to Anderson Park. So actually Wheeler is immediately adjacent to Glenfield Park, and Oakcroft is immediately adjacent to Anderson Park, and both of those have a little bit of tie into the history of the site. So these are four pictures of rather typical buildings within these two survey areas. The top left and the lower right are Oakcroft, and the opposite two are from Wheeler. Next. That's all right. So the firm surveyed 210 properties in both areas. So 97 of those properties are located in the Wheeler Street neighborhood. 113 properties are located in the Oakcroft neighborhood. So this is sort of the summary of sort of looking at both districts, but I will be talking about Wheeler separately from Oakcroft. I won't go back and forth because it gets a little confusing. And then as part of the work, what we did was we looked at all the properties and developed an architectural description for all 210 properties, looked at the overall history of Montclair, and then placed the history of Wheeler Street neighborhood and the Oakcroft neighborhoods in the timeline of Montclair's history, and then determined, based on those histories and the development of those neighborhoods, the period of significance for each. So period of significance is the period in which something developed, where it has its most historical connotation. It generally begins when, at least on individual buildings, when construction starts, and then sort of when its broad a sense of history kind of sets in stone. With regard to neighborhoods, it's very similar, particularly for Wheeler Street and Oakcroft, where development really started in the early 20th century, even though we had some late 19th century construction prior, and then there was this gigantic boom of building until about the Great Depression. Wheeler Street developed from about 1910 to 1930, and the Oakcroft neighborhood kind of completed all its corners by 1946. And I'll explain a little bit more specifically where all that comes from. And then in addition to determining the period of significance, which sort of sets the boundaries for how we look at the overall district and then the individual buildings within the district, we determined at the level of we look at it for the intensive level survey as how the New Jersey and National Register looks at buildings. So it's either contributing or non-contributing resources or key contributing resources. So key contributing resources are those buildings that really typify and of what the history of the development of the neighborhood are, and then are also really good examples and retain a significant amount of historic fabric. Contributing resources are those that sort of are of the consistent nature of the architecture within the district, and then non-contributing resources are either built after the time period of significance, right? So there's a set date, 1930, anything built after 1930, not contributing, or were constructed during the period of significance but have been so altered that they no longer reflect their historic appearance, so therefore they're not contributing. For Montclair, which is their local districts, they look at non-contributing in a couple of different manners, and that's actually outlined in the reports. It's what are the three? It's intrusive, harmonizing, altered, and is it just three? There's just three. So there's three ways to look at the properties with how they work within the district, and that's how Montclair designates their non-contributing resources, but they still also have the key contributing and the contributing. Next. So Wheeler Street, one of the things I want to say about these two districts, it's really interesting how both developed almost exactly at the same time, but in radically different ways and for completely different populations in terms of the appeal for each was different. So it's too interesting to look at, even though we looked at them separately. When you're looking at things side by side, it makes for an interesting story. So Wheeler Street developed around, so Tony's Brook, which you're all familiar with, was light manufacturing developed, beginning with Crane, I want to say in the early 18th century, and the last major manufacturer was J.G. Wheeler and Company, who manufactured straw board, which is kind of similar to like cardboard. His factory closed in 1887, but that's where we get the Wheeler name, is that he owned most of the property that was the Wheeler Street neighborhood. So when his factory closed, when they subdivided the new roads, one of them was named Wheeler after him because he owned property there. Adjacent to the district is the Maple Avenue School, which is now the Glenfield Middle School. That was constructed in 1896 on the same property that the Wheeler Manufacturing Company was. And by 1904, the Maple Avenue Park was developed also on the same property. But when the town gave control over to Essex County, because Essex County was developing its park system, they changed it to Glenfield Park. So by 1906, the survey area roads are laid out. Let me just see if the map. Can we move to the map? So by 1906, just for orientation purposes, so this is Glenfield Park, Maple Avenue, which connects to Bloomfield, and then Willowdale and Lincoln are the boundaries, and then we've got Monroe Place and Wheeler set in between. So by 1906, the Wheeler and Monroe Place have started to be laid out. However, there are already properties constructed along Lincoln Street, single-family residences, and then there's one property actually in that block on Maple Avenue, which is still there, but not recognizable in any way. It's still there. By 1910, we begin to see the first of the two-family residences constructed in the neighborhood. So, for instance, they generally fall on Willowdale Avenue, Wheeler Street, and Monroe Place, and are constructed through the 1930s. And I'll actually provide some examples of those visually so you can see what I'm talking about. But these two-family residences are constructed specifically to appeal to working-class families, and based on the census research we did, the owners were primarily Italian, and we can actually trace back some of them to the Pine Street neighborhood, where they were renters, and then when they moved to Wheeler Street, they became owners. And then we also have a fair amount of rentals to African Americans who have migrated from the South, so primarily Virginia, the Carolinas, Maryland. And we can see all of that in the census research, and you can see when they start having children, like, you know, they're young couples that come up, and then you see the children being born in the houses and things like that. So that's one part of the district. The other part is the apartment buildings. There are a number of apartment buildings. They start being constructed in 1912. The first ones are the Luciano building, which is actually one of the big buildings that was shown on the cover at 2729 Woodland Avenue. Then you have 5 Woodland Avenue and 15 Maple, as well as a bunch of others. And they too also get constructed between 1912 and about 1929. Move on. So like I said, here's the district, the boundaries. Next. So this is 115 Lincoln Street. So this was constructed in 1897. It's what we call an American Foursquare, and it is a key contributing building because it actually retains a fair amount of, it's actually really good architectural integrity. The major change that we noted was they applied later siding, but it was the type of siding where the original siding is probably still extant underneath. And this predates the construction on Wheeler and Monroe and Willowdale. Next. Another pre-1910 is a really good example of a Queen Anne, also key contributing resource at 127 Lincoln Street. This actually was on a larger piece of property and was subdivided in the 60s, and its neighbor, which I don't have a picture of, is a split level, and that is a non-contributing resource. So there's a few of them. This is 29 Wheeler Street, and this is sort of a very typical two-family residence that was constructed. And what was great about how these were constructed was it was a stacked plan, so that there's similarity between the first and second floor, and it was a very economical way of providing affordable housing. But you still had, rather than a front yard, porches were very prevalent, so bringing the front yard in a different way to this neighborhood. And then some of them have rear yards, but you can see the buildings are set pretty close together because they really maximize the properties on the lots. And there's a good variety. This house is very interesting. This is one of the first ones that was built in 1910 Colonial Revival. It was actually constructed by, it was built by, let me just find his name because I always get it wrong, Clinton Summers. And in the census and in the city directories, I could pinpoint his movement, which is really quite interesting. He was actually an African American man from Virginia who was a slater, so he did all the roofing. And he actually lived originally on Cherry Street, where I can find them in the city directories. And his neighbor was Pasquale Ucci, and he lived on Pine Street, just around the corner from Mr. Summers here. And Mr. Ucci purchased or built the house like 2 doors down in the same year, so they became neighbors in the new neighborhood. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and I think something that is worth further exploration with regard to this neighborhood. It's really quite interesting how it evolved and who was living there. And as part of we're also recommending to place the district on the New Jersey and National Register, and so more research would be necessary for that to kind of make that argument about the social and cultural history of the Wheeler Street neighborhood. And you'll see that I'll kind of compare and contrast this to Oakcroft, which is more architectural than social. So these are a couple of the apartment buildings that were constructed, and actually this building, this one in particular, the 33 Woodland, which is now also the home of, and I always get this wrong, so I wrote it down, the Woman's, thank you, Montclair Women's Community Circle, which was actually developed in 1961 in this building, but Of course, this building predates that, so it looked like it was another club prior to that. It was a store. Yes, right. The city directories and the building lot don't always align because they changed the numbers over the years. So it was sometimes difficult to track, particularly on Woodland, what building they were talking about when I was looking at the city directories. Also, in the Luciano building, there was also a store as well. So, really great neighborhood. Next, and let's go back one more. I love that apartment building. It's very plain, but you can see there's a lot of detail in the windows, over the lintels, and then the cornice line is really quite nice. And then the brickwork on 33 Woodland is also very nice. Next. More apartment buildings, so 24 Woodland Avenue, we consider this a contributing resource. We do see some changes to it, but nothing that would take away the feel of the building. There's a lot of apartment buildings with painted metal cornices, all still intact. This is a really beautiful building, also one of my favorites in the neighborhood because the brick is sort of this very kind of bluey. There's like a highlighted brick that's bluey, and then whoever did the renovations kind of drew it out in the colors they picked for the sills, the stone sills. Next. So this was interesting. When I did the survey work, I started with this building, and that's a nice building. That's pretty cool. And then right next door was that building. I'm like, wow, those are exactly the same, just minor changes. And then I went to the next building. I'm like, those three are all the same. And they were all constructed by Michael DuPont in 1926. So we could see how he sort of had a model, and he adjusted it slightly for each building in terms of how he treated the porches. Now, of course, this is probably the original porch. That's an enclosed porch, but that would have been a later addition. And then it looks like this one underwent more recent renovation, so its columns are a little bit more adjusted. But you can really see the evolution of the buildings and how how he kind of took that model and like I said, economically provided multifamily housing in a great way. Next. So this is actually the home of Aubrey Lewis, 38 Willowdale Avenue, and again one of my actually favorite buildings before I even knew it was Aubrey Lewis's house. Great architecture in terms of how the use of the brick and the colored brick and the segmental arched windows, and it's really great. And it has an immediate neighbor that shares a porch, which is interesting. So Aubrey Lewis was he grew up here partially. I'm not sure when he left, but he was in the 1940 census. His parents were in the 1925 New Jersey census. They were just married 1 year in 1925, and so you could see the census records. The census records for, I think they stop in 1940 federal wise. They give a gap, so in I think next year 1950 will show up in the Ancestry.com and various other places. So he is known for being a pioneer, a great athlete from Montclair High School, also a pioneer in many of the businesses that he was involved in terms of FBI. He worked for Woolworth and a whole bunch of other endeavors in New Jersey and nationally. So this was his family home early on. Next. So that's Wheeler Street. So Wheeler Street is both significant architecturally for how it provides affordable housing for working class families in both the two-story stacked family rather than sort of the duplex approach, where they're side by side, and as well as incorporating apartment buildings. I didn't really get into the apartment buildings too much in terms of there's more amenities by the time you get to the early 20th century than there would have been in the late 19th century, where you went down the hall to share a bathroom and all that kind of stuff. These actually, everything was self-contained in the apartment. It was all stacked along a center corridor or a side corridor, and again took that sort of stacked approach similar to the two-family residences, but in a bigger way, providing 5, 6, 7, that type of thing. So the Oakcroft development, like I said, developed around the same time as Wheeler, but for a completely different group of people. This was for upper and middle class families that were drawn to Upper Montclair because of the railroad. Montclair, as on the whole, developed primarily because of advances in transportation in the mid-19th century. Primarily, the advances began in the lower part of Montclair, where the train stations and the train lines ran. Once the train was moved up to the Greenwood Lake and other railroads were up at Upper Montclair, then you saw an increase in development there, where it had been kind of more of a sleepy Dutch community, which I've done a lot of research on Bergen County, and they tended to develop much slower than everybody else. They didn't like change, I guess. So in 1905, Anderson Park opens. And by 1906, there are plots sketched in adjacent to Anderson Park between North Mountain Avenue and the railroad track, and a handful of residences constructed on North Mountain Avenue and Brookfield Road. So can we go to the map too, so we can see that? So this is our district area. It's bound by Oakcroft on the one side, North Mountain Avenue, the park, so Parkside, to the north, and then Brookfield Road to the south. Only the one side of Brookfield. Of course, there's no residences on the north side of Anderson Park. Let me go back. So the area was actually surveyed by F.W. Crane in 1907, and the person who was primarily responsible for initial development in Oakcroft was Aaron Godfrey. He was, I call him a dabbler of many industries and professions before he settled on real estate development. There's a lot more history about his sort of background in the report, but it's interesting to note that this was sort of his first major endeavor into real estate development, and he worked with the Essex County parks, because Anderson Park, which is on the National Register, has its own sort of very interesting history, to help develop. He saw Anderson Park as a draw, and then worked with Essex County to sort of make sure that the residences on Parkside benefited from their proximity to the park. So Godfrey's Land and Building Company announced that it was going to build 100 homes in this area. And in 1910, there's a really important article in American Homes and Gardens magazine, which features 6 of the homes in Oakcroft that were designed by the New York architectural firm of Freeman and Hasselman. And I have examples of that later on. By 1916, 47 homes were constructed by Godfrey, but he actually stopped development around that time, had moved on to other development areas, but the balance were constructed in the 20s and 30s, and you can actually see in the building code, the building permits, developers or builder developers buying multiple residences or multiple properties and building very similar residences right next to each other or across the street from one another. So that's an interesting part that's worth tracking. And then sort of the last significant construction was at the corner of North Mountain Avenue, Parkside. It was sort of the biggest property that was undeveloped after the 1930s. That was done in 1946 by an architect, and it really works with the architecture of the overall neighborhood. So it kind of sets the date of that end of period of significance that I talked about. Go on. Next. So this is one of the houses at 65 Brookfield Road, circa 1902. It's a shingle style. We consider it a key contributing resource given its level of significance and its architecture. It's got really beautiful stone walls as its that surrounds its porch, and an all-encompassing roof. It has many of the features of the shingle style. This was actually constructed prior to Oakcroft's development. So this is an example of one of the earlier buildings on Brookfield. Next. This is another early building, so circa 1900 Queen Anne. You can see it's actually a much bigger Queen Anne than the one that we saw in Wheeler. This is 305 North Mountain Avenue, also a really good example of its type and a contributing resource, constructed before Oakcroft really became developed in any great extent. Next. So these are the images that I was talking about with regard to the American Home and Garden. There was a particular style, it's called the Craftsman style, that they used primarily with also Tudor revival influences in the design of these homes, these initial homes that were kind of carried through much of the neighborhood in initial development. So this is 124 Edgemont Road, which is a key contributing resource because it really retains its architecture, its fenestration. It hasn't had any major significant additions. From what we could tell, it's enclosed its porch. It changed, the roofing type, material, but that's pretty typical throughout the neighborhood. Next. So this is 19 Princeton Place, where you could see the 1910 magazine picture of it, and you could see the picture we took it just recently, and it has an addition on it, right? But the addition is sympathetic to the original building, so we consider that still a contributing resource in the historic district. So it retains all its massing and everything like that, and because the addition was placed to the rear of the front facade, and it didn't really change the porch and all the relationships of the porch to the main building, it shows what you can do in a historic district with regard to being able to add to your house while still maintaining the architectural integrity of the original building. Next. This is another similar, some sort of circa 1907 Craftsman style contributing resource. It has undergone some minor changes in terms of the windows have been replaced, but to the person sort of walking down the street, you wouldn't really know that. So it retains its roof line. It's the beautiful edge of how the shingles kind of fold over the eaves. Really quite exquisite building in a very simple form. Next. And then this is actually one of the later buildings that I was talking about with regard to the builder infill. And the predominant style there was Colonial Revival. This is actually a really good example of a very simple Colonial Revival house that is located and actually faces Anderson Park on Parkside. And it too has a major addition off the rear of the building, but like you could barely see it. It does nothing to the front facade in terms of interrupting anything. It's a really good example and a contributing resource. And then this is examples of two houses that were built side by side, or pretty much side by side, on Brookfield by the builder contractor Paul Goen, although Goen is a guess because the handwriting of the people in the on the permit things was not great. His name changed multiple times. So so this is 49 and 53 Brookfield Road. These are really two good examples of Craftsman style homes that were built, very similar in style and features. You could see the dormers are all the same, the overhang, how the porches are articulated, and with very little changes. I think it's a rear addition, but you can barely notice it. Next. And then every neighborhood has a famous person, so this is actually, I'm sure most of you know this because there's signs in the neighborhood. This is Buzz Aldrin's house. He shows up also in the 1940 census. He's actually 10 years older than R.B. Lewis at that time. I was hoping that maybe that they were in high school together, but no. Because I knew nothing about R.B. Lewis before this, and I knew barely or hardly anything about Buzz Aldrin. So this is a really good example. This is actually, this particular model, there's another one just a block away, very similar, just tweaked a little bit differently. I forget the street address. I think that's it. Oh, no. Okay. So our recommendations are for the Wheeler Street neighborhood. I'm going to jump back. Like I said, is a period of significance of 1910 to 1930, which is its predominant period of construction, so initial development all the way until the Great Depression, where basically countrywide we saw things stop for everyone. Significance is under criterion A. So again, a distinction. We look at this in terms of how districts are seen with regard to the New Jersey National Register, because the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office and the federal government basically pays for these things. So we looked at it in terms of under their criterion, but their criterion is very similar to the criteria established by Montclair. So criterion A is sort of how either a building or a neighborhood relates to the broader history of a particular, it could be Montclair, it could be, veterinary sciences, it could be a variety of topics. But in this case, it is how the neighborhood developed to respond to the needs of working class families that were either already in Montclair or were moving to Montclair at a rapid rate to actually respond to all the other development that was happening in Montclair due to the advances in transportation in the area. And then there's also the layer of the Italian immigrant predominantly in the area, as well as African American families who were migrating from the South to the area for work and business opportunities. And it's really interesting when we looked at the city directories and the census. Like I said, I only pointed out Mr. Summers and Mr. Ucci, but there was a whole bunch of examples of that you could see, which would be really a great study to do if we had a time. We had very narrow focus. And then significance under criterion C, which means it's architecture, so a good example of a certain style, or done by a popular architect or something like that. But in this case, it really is the response architecturally of the buildings, and then the use of the Craftsman, Colonial, or Queen Anne styles in how the buildings are articulated. The integration of the porches. There's a whole layer of architectural components that you could look at in the neighborhood that really the neighborhood speaks to, that are particular for that time period. And then we do recommend, like I said, the designation as a local district. We are also saying to consider registration on a New Jersey National Register, but we're recommending actually a broader geographic area for Wheeler Street that would incorporate more of Maple Avenue and also Glenfield Park. So, and that would require more study in order for that to actually be determined whether our recommendation is actually feasible, and it may also incorporate then a broader period of significance as well. Next. And then for the Oakcroft neighborhood, very similar designation as a local historic district with a period of significance of 1906 to 1946. So that's the year when major development really started. It doesn't negate those that were already built on North Mountain and Brookfield, because they survived during the period of significance. And then to 1946, when the last property on Parkside was developed. Significance under criterion A really has to do with the development of the area with regard to responses in transportation, which would also be, I talk a lot about the railroad, but it's also the trolley and the automobile, because the automobile you actually can see on Maple Avenue, and going back to Wheeler Street, you can actually see the growth of auto mechanic buildings to be able to respond to the more importance of the railroad. So there's a lot of layers. It's a big onion to peel. And then significance under criterion C is for the architecture. So There is a very cohesive, the architecture at Oakcroft is cohesive in that it has a couple of styles that it uses in terms of the articulation of the buildings. The scale of them are all very similar. You do see some variation from street to street in terms of Parkside and Princeton, have a little bit bigger lots, where Godfrey and Edgemont have smaller lots, so the buildings are commensurate with their lot sizes. But you can see the influence of the Craftsman, Colonial. You can also see what I was talking about in terms of the builder-developer picking a couple of lots, and you can see how they tweaked the facades or the plan layouts slightly to make everyone unique, but still made it very inexpensive for themselves to do it, since repetitiveness makes in construction is economical. And then also consider incorporation or consider New Jersey a National Register designation. Anderson Park is already individually listed on the New Jersey National Register, but I think its history is important to how Oakcroft developed. So there should be some consideration about incorporating that history into the overall discussion. And then one of the things we recommend in the report, which I don't talk about here, is I'd really love to see if we can figure out why Godfrey stopped developing in Oakcroft before he reached his 100 houses. Because he went on and moved on and started developing in other areas of Montclair, and I'm wondering if he took a hit and took some lessons learned as he moved on to the next one, but you don't know. And when you look at the advertisements for Oakcroft, he advertised both in the New York Times and in the Montclair Times. In the New York Times, he appealed to the railroad, right? Said, it's very convenient to the railroad. In the Montclair Times, he said, well, we're very convenient to the trolley. So he was pulling from two different geographic areas. He knew who his audience was, and he appealed to that. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Margaret. Some really interesting research, and I haven't had a chance to look at the total study yet, but it looks like you've really did really in-depth research, so thank you. As Graham, as we said before, this is an informational meeting, so we're going to ask people if they have any questions that they would like to ask of either Margaret with the document or Graham with the methodology or the timeline. Our next meeting will be an official HPC meeting, which would be December 10th. And at that point, the HPC will vote whether to accept this and go forward with the historic district. And as Graham explained, it will then go to the council, and then it goes to the planning board, and then it goes back to the council. And then it goes into our ordinances. Everything is online. It's Montclair, what is it, Montclair Township?
MontclairNJUSA.org/Oakcroft Wheeler.
Okay, and it's on the township website. And if anyone hasn't yet used the township website, it really is a wealth of information. If you go into historic preservation, a interactive map comes up. It designates all the different historic districts. We haven't really touched on the difference between national, state, and local districting. That might be a question. But also today, Graham posted on the website under historic.
Yeah, and there's actually a number of copies over at the far end of the table. It's a frequently asked questions with
Right.
respect to historic designations document. We put together about 25 different questions and provided some answers there. So in the event that your question isn't answered this evening, it may be perhaps contained in that document. Certainly a valuable resource, and that will be up on the website for everybody to download and access as well. But I think we want to use the balance of the time this evening for any questions or comments that members of the public have here in person. So I have a microphone. I'll run it back to you so you can get your question. Well, we are being broadcast, so this is for the...
My simple question is there someplace in this documentation or someplace in the meeting that somebody is going to address to the property owners
Well, so I think that we've included two responses on this in the frequently asked questions document. The first is we've included a couple of references to national and statewide studies that have been done on the value of historic districts. There's, I believe, 3 specific studies that were linked in that document provided by the New Jersey Historic Trust. The second component is with respect to cost for repairs, as you mentioned. I would like to note that whilst there are certain modifications that are subject to review by the HPC, however, all repairs that are like-for-like material or like-for-like in their replacement are exempt from any review by the HPC. So those repairs can proceed as normal as anyone would do repairs at their home. Should a homeowner be interested in changing or modifying something, that's where an application to the HPC comes in. And there's details on filing that application, the costs associated with that, and there's a little bit of time with respect to that as well. The application fee is $100 to the HPC. And that's something that we can assist through our office in filing that application and getting you before the HPC.
Yes, my more specific question then to follow that up, and I won't take much more time on this, is that I have a non-contributing house, albeit it seems to be one of the first that was built there, and I think Godfrey may have even lived in it, I'm not sure. All of the changes that have been made, the house looks nice, it looks consistent, but it's non-contributing.
Mm-hmm.
Are you telling me that whatever on the outside that I can repair exactly as it is now? Or does it then have to conform with the historic district? Because there are certain things about this property which would not be consistent with that. I'm thinking specifically of a fence.
So specifically, the way the ordinance reads currently is that like-for-like replacement, as is, based on this survey, would not be subject to review. So if you're going to replace something as it stands now presently, then that would not be subject to review by the HPC.
I'll pass this on to whoever has.
If you could she's bringing the microphone over to you, just.
You sort of sidestep that question on the cost in filing these things.
If you could just use the microphone for the
In
broadcast.
filing these applications, are there drawings required, architectural fees, anything along those lines that you can?
Sure. So typically, a lot of the required changes that require an application to the HPC also simultaneously require a filing for a building permit, a construction permit to the building office. So window replacements, for example, or other filings for permits will require some documentation or materials put together as far as specifications or plans or something.
And that's the same documentation
And that would be
in
the
both
same
cases?
documentation that would be subject to review by the HPC. Mhm.
Hey there. I have a number of questions. I guess the first one is maybe a follow-up to that one. Is there like a pre-application meeting or information that we can get to understand what types of things would be acceptable? Like, I would imagine like somebody wanting to do an addition to their home. If you're going to file it with the Department of Buildings, you would go through a process of developing drawings and design and so forth. And that costs a lot of money to work with an architect. Is there like a sort of pre-application meeting that could happen, or information that could be gleaned at the onset of like what would be acceptable, what an acceptable approach would be to?
Well, there's a number of resources that are available to assist in that process. The first and probably most important is the historic design guidelines that were adopted by the HPC in 2016 as well?
16.
In March of 2016. This document goes through in detail to recommend appropriate addition types, styles, placement, fenestration patterns, massing scale, all of those things are contained within the design guidelines. So that's typically the first reference point. Typically, I can tell you from experience, in our office in planning and zoning, we're kind of the first stop. Anytime anybody hires an architect in town, we're the first place that your architect comes to ask these questions. It is at that time that we advise, hey, this property is in a historic district, you're going to need to read the design guidelines, and we can give some preliminary feedback as far as the process and the approach goes. And the ordinance is very clear, and it's item number 14 of my frequently asked questions. It goes through in detail and explains what is subject to review and what's not subject to review. So I think there's a lot that we do at the onset to assist in that process to help kind of split things out. And our office does assist and liaise with the Historic Commission. Has a historic preservation consultant on retainer. So if there is a question or somebody wants to approach the consultant with a design idea concept, we engage that person to share the design with them before it even gets to the commission to get some initial feedback and kind of iterative response. So.
And I'd just like to add, if the design of the HPC consultant, if you'd like to see an example of what this person actually does, if you go on to the planning board and go onto any open applications, you can actually look at HPC, what is it called? HPC report. And that will give you an idea of what he comments. And that's part of, he's on the payroll for the township, but that does not cost anything to somebody who's applying to, to do something.
A couple more questions. What do you anticipate, once somebody files with the, for a building permit, what kind of additional time do you think that this review process will take? And I know it depends on the type of thing that's being proposed.
Yeah. So by statute, the HPC has to review the application within 45 days and make a decision. So they're bound by time to do this all within a month and a half. So it's not like there's exceedingly a months-long process here. The HPC does have a time constraint within which they need to review and approve or make a decision on any type of application of this nature.
And was also wondering, like, what the sort of scope, you probably answered this in some of the materials, but what the scope of review is going to be. For example, if somebody wants to change the paint color of their home, is that going to be part of it? And, things in the back of the house that are less visible, like a back deck or something like that, is that considered part of the review of a contributing structure?
So the ordinance is very clear in that it's modifications that are only publicly visible. So a back deck would not be subject to review. Changing a patio door to a sliding glass door at the back of your house is not subject to review. Things that are not visible are not subject to review. The HPC has not weighed in on color. It's been, as the chair will testify, it's been a discussion, but we have a recommended set of colors in the design guidelines, but they do not typically comment or require any type of color. That's not something that the HPC has done. And painting of existing painted surfaces are free to be painted in any color they're choosing.
Okay.
So it's a recommended color palette.
Palette, right.
It's a palette. And which is really based on what the historic district is made of.
And again, but the design guidelines are really recommendations. They're not anything
it's
that's
not
required to
binding.
follow.
Okay. Last question.
Sure.
If everything moves forward, when do you think, what's the sort of time frame where this might take effect?
So that's where things kind of move out of the jurisdiction of the HPC. Once it gets to the council, so as the chair mentioned, on December 10th, the commission will convene and conduct their public hearing, which is required by ordinance. At that public hearing meeting, they'll hear the comments from supporters and any opponents to register their comments with the commission. The commission then will take a motion and vote on whether to advance the nomination proposals to the council for consideration. Once they advance to the council phase, that's where the council kind of holds the keys on the process. So they're the ones that are in charge of making the referral over to the planning board. Then the planning board has a statutory requirement to review the nomination proposals, discuss them, and then make a recommendation back to the council. And then the council then will proceed with their introduction and second reading, which is the public process, and then their final vote. So we're looking at kind of a couple months, probably, I'd say, post-December to complete that process.
Okay.
So.
Got it.
So we live on a corner. Basically, the whole house is visible. So the back of the house that's away from the main street is still something that's going to be subject to review?
The way the ordinance reads, it is public view. So, each property is unique with what's visible and not. But yet, that's the way that the ordinance currently reads, is with respect to public view.
And then what about things like swing sets, structures in the backyard? Again, it's all visible from the street because we're on a corner. That's something you have to get a historical
So
shed?
I can tell you that typically here within the township, temporary structures such as swing sets don't go through a permitting process. So, those are something that would not be subject to review. Other things such as sheds, if they're publicly visible, yes, they would be subject to review.
And then, the landscaping, any of that kind of stuff?
No, landscaping is not subject to review.
Thank you.
So, can you explain the motivation for doing this? It seems that got bypassed in the presentations. What are the advantages to the town advantages and disadvantages, and to the homeowners' advantages and disadvantages. Can you explain all that?
Well, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. It started with the historic preservation element of the master plan, which is 2016, I believe. And within that, the consultants identified 20 areas, proposed historic areas. So 11, I believe 11 were residential, some are parks, and 2 are streetscapes. So from that, going forward, what the HPC did was to discuss amongst the commission, open to the public as well, what would be the which neighborhoods, districts, which I'm saying neighborhoods and districts of interchangeably, that would really benefit from having the historically designated. So I think if you look at some of the information that we have put up on the frequently asked questions, that the benefits are really benefits for the entire town, to keep the historic characters of these neighborhoods, to really discourage knockdowns, and put up something inappropriate that would be within the neighborhood. To do that, you have to have a designated neighborhood with boundaries. I think it's a matter of, we always talk about Montclair as being a diverse community with numerous neighborhoods, many different types of architectural styles. And I think I know for myself, I've been a resident for 42 years now, and what drew us to this town really was the housing stock, not only the housing stock, but the commercial stock as well. You know, Bloomfield Avenue and Upper Montclair Village. I happen to live in Upper Montclair. But I think that what we're seeing is people are becoming more concerned with what's happening with the development, which is not part of this per se, but concerned with what may happen in neighborhoods and trying to maintain the characteristics of the neighborhood. Does that answer your question?
No.
Oh, okay.
The benefits then are to the town, but I asked
they're
also the benefits to the homeowner
Well, they're
and
to
the disadvantages.
the residents of the town would have a cohesive neighborhood that would maintain its historic character. As far as, I don't understand what you mean by disadvantages. Doesn't everyone want to live in a attractive, neighborhood surrounded by, attractive buildings that are characteristic of the neighborhood?
Well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and it
Okay.
might be that some owners would want to do something that other people might not like so much. Don't you think?
Well, it is in the eye of the beholder, and that's your opinion.
All right. So, the advantages are mainly to the town. That's what I heard you say.
Well, I think they're also to the residents of the town. I don't think it's to the town. I think it's to the residents of the neighborhoods. It's to the residents of Wheeler Street, to the residents of Oakcroft, to any of the prospective, districts that are listed in here. One is Upper Montclair Commuter District. Help me out here, Graham. What are some of the other ones that we're
There's
talking?
a number of them.
There's a 1950 split level little enclave, I forgot the name of it, but just to keep, the cohesive neighborhood, characteristic of the neighborhood.
Just follow up on that. I think what everybody's searching for is, all of us, I presume here, are property owners. We want a specific answer as to what the financial benefit or detriment to the value of our houses and the financial cost that it's going to be above and beyond not living in a historic district. Nobody seems to want to answer that.
Well, I have a statement from Philip Berman, who is the immediate past president of the West Texas Board of Realtors. He couldn't come tonight. He's also a Realtor Associate for Berkshire Hathaway Home Services. He has said that, I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs saying that basically that I guess you're talking about property values and home values, that they're actually increased. There's been a number of studies which are on our right here on this list that you can find online. The New Jersey Historic Trust has 3 documents that are online that are really very interesting to read for people that are concerned about this. But this Mr. Berman, who works in West Essex, said that designated historic districts can be guaranteed that neighboring residents will not undertake redesigns or additions that are not in keeping with the general nature of the immediate area, and do not use components that are similar but not equal to the original or otherwise compromise the architectural beauty of the neighborhood. Planning board and zoning boards can prevent a charming Victorian from becoming a bagel store, but they cannot prevent a homeowner from choosing to do away with fishtail cedar shingle in favor of plastic vinyl siding, or the selection of a color palette that would be perfectly tasteful in a Craftsman Foursquare but totally inappropriate on the owner's Georgian Revival. The value of a neighborhood is based on the value of the individual homes in that neighborhood, and one home that becomes an architectural unappealing mess, or one that doesn't harmonize well with the other surrounding homes, devalues every home in the neighborhood. Studies have shown that homes subject to preservation rules increase in value at a greater rate and are less subject to declines in value during a recessionary housing market. And again, that information is available online from New Jersey Historic Trust.
Hello, my name is Gay Overby Cole, and I actually live on Wheeler Street, and one of my house is designated in the Wheeler Street area. I'm also a member of the club, which is 33 Woodland Avenue, which is Montclair Women's Community Circle. My question is that, and I kind of understand what this young lady over here is saying. So you deem these houses or this area historical. Now, on my block, there's been changes. In fact, my block is now looking like they call San Francisco. There's some houses that's been gutted and renovated where they are definitely out of character of the homes on my block. One particular house sold on my block for $799,000, where my house right now, yes, it is a little eyesore because I need painting and fixing up in the whole 9 yards. So I understand that if we deem Wheeler Street area as historical, I can only fix the outside. Well, I can fix the outside of my house, but it has to remain the same. But then when I listened to this young man, one of the things I wanted to do was put an addition and actually raise the roof on my house. So if they deem the area historical, I can put the addition on the back, but I won't be able to raise the roof. Is that correct?
So I want to clarify that, it's not that I was explaining what is exempt from a review. So an addition at the back would not require a review by the HPC. You can proceed with the request to do an addition at the front of your property. It would just require that additional step to have a review by the HPC to review the modification and determine its appropriateness. And they'll make some recommendations or change the roof style or something, to help it fit in with the existing dwelling that you have at the house. But no, it's not meant to preclude residents from making modifications. It's to make sure that modifications are consistent with the types and style of dwellings within the neighborhood.
Okay. Second question. My second question is, if you do deem Wheeler Street, that area, historical, what type of money are you going to give to the homeowners, or grant money that's going to be available to the homeowners to actually fix up their houses?
Now there isn't any grand-
So,
So,
you know,
Chris-
I think, you know, the difficult process for us is that, you know, we are not the Department of Finance for the township, so I can't specifically
understand
answer
that.
that question. However, what I can tell you is that the commission has been working to advocate our state legislators down in Trenton to restore funding for grant programs by the state. The state has previously run historic preservation grant programs, and we've been working, our commissioners have made recommendations and calls to our state legislatures to push that to restore funding for those exact types of things that you're discussing.
Third question.
Sure.
Glenfield Park. Okay? So if we deem Glenfield Park, Wheeler Street area, as historical, will additional funding, Green Acres money, be supplied to the county or whoever to actually fix up the Glen at Glenfield Park?
Can I
Well,
answer
you
that
can answer,
question?
yeah.
Yeah, so when you when a publicly owned facility is listed on the register, there is money available for that. You'd have to tell me a little bit more about specifically what you're talking about, but yes, there would definitely be, there's more money available to publicly owned properties that are listed on the register than there currently are for homeowners, right? So, but there is a tax credit program that has gotten very close to being approved. It actually has been approved in the state legislature twice. It's just hit the governor's desk, the previous governor, and stopped. This current governor has it on his agenda to actually include tax credits. Now, whether he gets it through the legislature is another story, but we actually see it closer than we have I've been doing this for 30 years. This is the closest I've seen it in 30 years. So there is a possibility. I'm not going to make any promises, but there's definitely a push for it. And there's definitely a need. There's definitely a need.
Yes.
And once that goes through, actually, there'll be actually a greater push for local historic districts statewide than is currently seen. So, okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
So a few questions from me. The first one is the question here, is it possible that both would be approved or both would be disapproved, or is it one
So
of
the
them
commission
would be approved?
will be reviewing them independently. So they'll,
Mhm.
you know, review and rule on Wheeler Street and review and rule on Oakcroft. And again, the commission's, you know, determination on December 10th is not the end of this process. It's really just the beginning of the longer process I explained.
Right. And then regarding the opportunity to object or to provide more information, what are the appropriate forums or times to do that?
Oh, you should explain. what
Yeah,
it-
so unfortunately, I don't have the exact statute language, so I don't want to misquote this, but we do have, I don't think it's even over there. It's 10 I believe it's 10 days prior to the December 10th meeting. A formal objection has to be filed with the, oh, yes. Sure, that wasn't the question, but I'll start there as well. So the commission will be mailing public notices next week to all property owners within each of the districts, notifying them of the public hearing on December 10th. Then, should there be any objectors, they have 10 days prior to file a formal objection with our department, and then that will be read into the record at the meeting on December 10th.
I wanted to ask about the difference between key contributing, and non-contributing houses. Is there a difference in terms of, for example, if a non-contributing house wants to do any change, is it still something that needs to go through approval, or is it just for contributing and key contributing houses?
The regulations currently within the ordinance are consistent for all types of properties.
And then you mentioned the element of publicly visible. So is that something that the homeowner can determine by themselves what is publicly visible? Like, because as someone I think mentioned, the house could be on the corner, parts of the house might be slightly visible. Is it something that needs to go through approval anyway, or is it the homeowner kind of discretion in terms of, is it something that is clearly visible or not visible?
Well, public view is defined in the ordinance, so there's a definition that you can read through which provides that exact language. And it is something that, you know, I think this is kind of it's a two-way process here. I think there's some stewardship role on the side of the homeowners to understand their role within the historic district and the importance that brings. But then also on the township side, there is an enforcement, and review process to make sure that changes that are being done to properties are consistent with what's required in the ordinance. So, I think that's where it kind of gets into that question. And if there is any question on this, and there's there's an appeal process that's set forth in the ordinance as well for homeowners to appeal any decision by the commission to the Zoning Board of Adjustment, who's the ultimate arbiter in these cases.
And then finally, I think the question that keeps coming up is around the property price. And I think the question there, and I think where I'm specifically, I'm a bit confused, is I feel that if I would look for a house and I would know that it's in a historical zone and I would have more trouble making changes to it, I might prefer not to buy it and keep looking. Although you have research that shows that that's not the case in other places. Is there, in that research, is there explanation, is it just a research in terms of the data, or is there explanations on why they believe the prices actually go up for historical districts?
I don't have the actual language with me.
And part of it, I mean, is what you said before about the
Yeah,
consistency of the neighborhood and the fact that it remains the same.
And
but-
what realtors have also said, that people really want to buy into these historic neighborhoods because it maintains the integrity. People, and again, it's personal preference that people would want to live, perhaps not live next door to a vinyl-sided house. It's really the characteristic of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
Can I just add to the economic study? So I worked for the New Jersey Historic Trust when it happened. So they actually, at least one of the three studies that they're noted, they had non-preservation people actually do the study on the values of properties based on being in historic district and non-historic district. They went to the business school in Rutgers and did an extensive survey. This was a couple years old. It has actually, I think, been updated a couple of times. So they did try to take we tend to work with our heart in the preservation community. They went to people who worked more with their head in that regard. So they went with that kind of eye towards looking at we felt that it would increase. They proved through statistics that it did.
Yes, and if you pick up one of the FAQs, number 11, speaks directly to that. How does designation affect property values? So the last one, there's 4 studies, and the last one is entitled Measuring Economic Impacts of Historic Preservation.
Yes, so we have lived at one of the properties listed as a contributing property in Oakcroft on the corner of Edgemont Road for 50 years. And we are certainly as budget conscious as anybody. I would even wager we have the least income and amount of money of anybody in this room. But I must say we don't feel the least bit threatened by this type of designation. We don't feel that it would be onerous financially or make things any worse than living in Montclair and living in the state of New Jersey, which is an expensive town in an expensive state, and I think we all kind of knew that going into it. But I just wanted to make a brief comment and then ask a question. We've lived around the corner from the Buzz Aldrin home for 50 years. And one of the comments made was, well, can't a person do whatever they would want to a house? So could a person come along and buy that house and turn it into a split-level condo? Sure they could. Would it be ideal? Would it be preferable? Would it be aesthetically pleasing? I don't think so. And I think the word that is not being paid enough attention to in the discussion is the word history. I see this as an effort to preserve Montclair's unique community history, a lot of which is embodied in its architecture. And there's a huge outcry that occurs every time a historic structure is demolished in town. There's an uproar, there's an outcry, there's petitions and protests. But this is an attempt to, as I see it, to counterbalance that threat. So I think we, want to consider that perspective as well when we're discussing this. So my question is about the status of the different houses, key contributing, contributing, and non-contributing. How fluid are those categories? Are they fluid at all? Are they final, or could a house move potentially from one category to another in the process once the historic district is approved?
So,
Because I think, quite frankly, our house should be a key contributing rather than a contributing.
I know which one you're talking about, and
Yeah.
you may be right, and part of that may be because if it was unclear what was original to what is current, like if I couldn't determine whether there were significant changes or not, then you got a contributing, right? So contributing and key contributing, there's really no difference other than a status thing, I guess, would be the thing. Some are marginal, right? In doing this, some I had said contributing and they moved to non-contributing, and some non-contributing moved to contributing. The more I understood the history and the evolution, and this was a very quick, intensive survey. I had to do 210 properties in 3 months. So it was a quick review, and I think if you asked for a reassessment, it could be done, absolutely.
Okay, just wondering.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to speak up and indicate there are those who embrace your efforts, so we hope that they go through.
Well said.
I also embrace the efforts. I think that historic preservation and designation is great for neighborhoods. I lived in a neighborhood in Florida for 14 years that was 1 block away from a designated neighborhood, and that neighborhood was designated while I lived there, and that neighborhood just blossomed in the most amazing way. Property values went way up. There was a lot of branding. It became a magnet to realtors. And my poor little neighborhood, which was 1 block away, got a little bit of the halo effect from that neighborhood, but we didn't benefit as greatly as a designated neighborhood. So I know that's just one anecdotal experience, but it really was quite a stark contrast. And the studies that we keep talking about do bear out that these homeowner property values do go up in residential neighborhoods when they're designated. I think some of you know that I have a website, which is historicoakcroft.org, which has at least 2 or 3 of these reports that you can go and look at and see what the statistics are, and as well as just anecdotal evidence.
Saying that it's not just, we're not specifically objecting, I think. It's trying to better understand.
So I have a question, and I love history, and I appreciate all of, Lisanne for decades now has been working to preserve the history of our neighborhood. I also am always a little skeptical of solving problems if there isn't a problem. Of fixing, what's the expression? I don't know, fixing something that's not broken, right? There have been some problems in Montclair. I don't know of any problems. I live in the Oakcroft neighborhood of people putting vinyl siding on. I know there's a few houses that have vinyl siding. They've had them for 50 years or so, at least one has, or a long time. But there's no tear downs that I know of, so I don't know what the problem is to be fixed, and I do worry about the burden on property owners, especially as Montclair. I also love paying taxes. I believe in taxes, but it has gotten very expensive for people. And so I just wanted to ask a clarifying question about the approval of changes. So I understand changes that are visible, which I think is a very subjective word, so that worries me. If you have to go through, like say my neighbor just put a deck on the back, a little bit is visible from the street. She had to go get approval for it because it was over the, it had to go through an approval process, and so then it would so my first question is, would someone flag that?
She needed a variance.
She needed a variance.
Yeah, that's a zoning issue. She didn't have the appropriate setback for that deck.
Right. So she needed a variance because it was bigger than her old one and bigger
It was
than.
closer to the property line.
Yeah. So would that then, could the town then say you have to be going through this if she does a deck thing? Like, whose burden is it to say that I have to also go through the historic process? If
Well-
she goes for a variance, can the town then say, hey, this is visible from the street, so we're going to have you go through this other hoop too?
So, well, so that, I guess, but we need to kind of separate, because we're starting to conflate some some land use
Please,
boards, and
tell me, yeah.
we need to try and make sure we stay in the appropriate lanes. So I think specifically in talking with respect to the HPC topic, which is what we're talking about here, yes, it is publicly visible. I mean, the ordinance language is a little bit gray, and it's not the best, but that's where the interpretation comes in, and we need to, review the proposed modification and make that determination. Typically, as I mentioned earlier, your architects and contractors come to our office first, and that's our first point of contact with folks to say, hey, there may be an HPC review that's required if this is visible, your proposed modification. So we strive at a staff level to make that known from the outset so that people are aware of that from the beginning and they know what they're kind of getting into. Second is, I think that with respect to the certificates of appropriateness, I mean, it's a clear process from there forward, going to the HPC, reviewing the design guidelines, and making your application to review the proposed modifications. Now, to kind of separate out the zoning issues, so right now, currently codified language in the ordinance sets forth that if anybody needs to go for a variance, and it is a visible change, we are making referral on those applications to the HPC already.
Okay.
And that's an administrative process. There's no additional requirements on the applicant. They're already going to the zoning board. It's just one additional meeting in advance of that to the HPC to review the proposed modifications. Essentially, state land use law allows only one body to make an approval. So, you can't have the HPC review it and deny it, and then you go to the zoning board, and what does the zoning board say? You already have, that's not how it works. The zoning board is the ultimate determiner, so the HPC just provides comments to them. So a great example on this that we've seen frequently on zoning board applications is front porch additions. Somebody wants to do an extension of their porch, add something on. This triggers both realms. It's publicly visible, and it needs a variance because of front yard setback relief. So the applicant makes an application to the zoning board of adjustment. We administratively at the staff level say this is in a historic district area, so the HPC gets to look at it, and they provide comments to the zoning board on the application. They say the proposed porch is consistent, looks nice, it's the same shape and style, and they send those comments over to the zoning board. And in many cases, what we've seen is that that commentary is helped at the zoning board. The zoning board says, well, this is great, the Historic Commission supports the change, let's go ahead and grant the variance because it's consistent, they feel it's appropriate. So I would just want to make clear that we can kind of conflate some of these topics when we talk about them, but it's important to make sure that we keep things a little bit
The thing
separate.
I'm trying to clarify is,
Sure.
I thought I heard, but I was walking in, apologize, I was late, where I thought it said the things in the back of your house won't need variances, or won't need approval, but that's not true. It could be the back of your house if it's,
So the follow-up commentary on that was this gentleman here who lives on a corner property. So,
Right.
In some instances, corner properties are more difficult
Okay.
because
but if it's not,
three
if
sides
it's,
may be
okay.
visible. But for an interior lot where you just want to do something on the back wall of your house that's not going to be visible, no, that would not be subject to review by the HPC.
Okay, my second question is about porches.
Mhm.
I just redid my porch, and I changed it from wood to cement with blue slate. I actually had an architect, it looks very nice.
Mhm.
It's not historically what was there, probably they were all wood porches, but I did it because we want to age in place, and this kind of porch is supposed to be, or steps, it's not a porch, it's steps, is supposed to be safer, and it is safer, because the wood would freeze all the time, and we fell on it. Is that the kind of thing that would be subject to, because I did have to go for a permit?
Yes, that would be subject to review by the HPC.
And do you know what they would do to, would the HPC approve a change like that from a wood steps to concrete steps?
So, as administrative staff, I don't know exactly where the HPC would go.
Who said no?
I read the ordinance, and if you look at it, it's lifetime, and
Yeah.
even wood windows, it all has to be done.
So I wanted to just say that. That's
So-
interesting to me. I just
So
made
I
this
just want
change.
to clarify, that was
If
with
that's
respect to
true.
repairs and exact replacements. There are applications that we've seen we have 4 existing commercial districts, historic districts.
Right.
We see requests for changes all the time at the commission right now. We just saw an application for the Shade Store on Bloomfield Avenue where they wanted to change the entry treads from concrete to a terrazzo tile, which they installed. The commission approved that. So it all depends on the application and what's presented to the commission. I don't want to say that no change is all that they're going to be interested in. I think as long as the change, remember the title of this document that they're giving is a certificate of appropriateness. Is the change appropriate for the dwelling? That's really the key question and the standards for review that the commissioners are set forth to look at. So in your case, the proposed stone may have been historically, if it's blue stone, may be consistent, and they may have
not
felt
be, though. It's 100 years old, and things have changed.
And that's where
just
the
like we
question-
planted invasive trees 100 years ago. Now we know we shouldn't do that, and wood now So if it's not, I would be upset if I had done that. And thank God I did it now, and I made my steps safer. And so I just want to highlight this issue. And I might have had to spend a lot more money and time.
And just
to
in
appeal.
furtherance to your point, the commission's approval or denial of your application in this instance would not be the end of the road. The Zoning Board of Adjustment has final jurisdiction over this. If you felt the decision was inappropriate or made an error, the Zoning Board has the ability to overturn that decision.
And what a hassle, and that goes back to my first point, is there a problem here that really needs to be fixed?
Can I just add that with an incident like yours and the design,
I know.
that the consultant, the HP consultant would have been, would have looked at your design and been helpful with you in when you were first coming forward with that.
Something might help. What's the percent of people who apply?
That's very helpful.
Does the township keep the, I don't think the township keeps.
Sorry, the question is, what is the percent of 100 people apply? What percent of those people get actually approved?
I can tell you that the commission has rendered very few outright denials of applications.
5%?
I've been here since 2015, and I can count maybe 5 to 10.
Out of how many total?
We typically average about 50 to 60 applications a year.
That's helpful.
I wanted to ask, I know that some of the part of the recommendations is also to have it in the New Jersey level or Essex County level. Would that require additional approvals if something needs to be done, or is it just one approval, as you mentioned?
No, so listing on the New Jersey and national registers is actually a protection of the property owner from either a government or a government undertaking. So if the town decided to widen North Mountain Avenue because the property is in the historic district, they would be either turned down or delayed or modified that recommendation because you're in the historic district. There's no extra onus on you to comply with anything. It really is as a protection for the property owner of a government undertaking. So.
And then as a follow-up to your question about, I guess, the Glen, I know that in part of the Oakcroft area, it's actually in a flood zone, and every big storm, we have a lot of floods in the area. Is that something that potentially could be, improved by this to preserve the homes that are suffering from the constant floods?
To be honest, I'm not that familiar with the flooding part. I know that, so for an example, when Sandy occurred in historic districts, there was more federal money to address the flooding issue, not only on the adjacent, like the public right-of-way, but also to the property owners themselves if they wanted to raise the building or other means. So there was more federal money provided to those historic buildings or historic districts than there was to non-historic districts. I just don't know the level to which it was, but I know there was. So.
And you mentioned before that there's other historic districts within Montclair. What are those?
Yes, the Town Center Historic District, Pine Street is a historic district, Watchung Plaza is a historic district, Upper Montclair Business District is a historic district. And then we do also have a number of individual residential properties that are also listed as well.
And they're all on the website. You can find them on the website.
Great, thank you.
If you go to the map, they'll be designated different colors.
Quick question about additions or, say, a non-contributing structure like a garage or something that had been replaced, like mid-century and so forth. I know that a lot of the language I was reading before, it's based on the Secretary of the Interior standards on how they approach new construction relative to the existing. So, typically they favor actually making a clear distinction between what was historic and what is new. So in the event of an addition, under those guidelines, you would want to clearly articulate that it's a new structure. It's not of the.
Yes,
you're not replicating the historic
Correct.
structure. Is that the approach that the town has taken
Yes.
in terms of approvals?
Yes, that's what that's what we
Yeah,
rely
the
on as our
township's
Bible.
design guidelines are
Right.
very similar.
Right. So you could you could actually do a contemporary, say, garage if your garage was reconstructed and not considered historic, or an addition that would have a bit more of a contemporary nature than. I guess it's just always a fine line on, you want it to relate well to the existing structures, of course, in a historic district, but making that distinction, I'm just curious.
Yeah, the Secretary of Interior Standards strives for relation without exact replication kind of thing. So you want it to relate to the historic structure, but you don't want to exactly replicate the existing historic structure.
And it doesn't it doesn't prevent contemporary. I know what you mean. Something a little bit more modern than to what would be a colonial revival. It doesn't prevent that as long as that addition, works with the older piece. Again, some of that is subjective, but if you follow the rules of architecture in terms of carrying heights and various features, but do it in a contemporary way, it's more than welcome, actually. I wish more of that happened in historic districts, personally.
So I think we heard that landscaping is not covered, but steps up to the house are covered. What about driveways and pathways leading to the house or leading to the garage?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, they're not in Glenridge.
Yeah, no, I don't think they would be covered by this, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, the ordinance specifically talks to structures, which stairs are structures that are physically mounted to the ground. Patioscaping and surfaces are not similar in that type of construction.
Okay.
Are there any other questions?
Just a brief follow-up. I notice in the FAQ document, it says, is there money available to help preserve old buildings? There are plans to provide historic tax credits. I realize it isn't approved or adopted yet, but I'm curious, how would that work in theory? Historic tax credits. Do we know, is there a specific system
Well, I think as Ms. Hickey explained earlier, there were two prior attempts legislatively by the General Assembly and the State Senate to advance legislation to the prior governor that were unsuccessful. And I don't believe that new legislation is really, I think it's still kind of in its early phases, so we don't know exactly how the legislation would function yet because they're still kind of crafting it to get to the governor's desk.
Okay.
There is, maybe we can find it
Yeah,
and post it to the website.
I have
because-
the information on that bill number is on that website of mine that I mentioned earlier, and it's the historic oakcroft.org. But if you go to the economic benefits tab on that website, at the very bottom of that page, there is a link to the bill for the proposed tax credit. So that information is available, and I don't remember it verbatim at all, but it does talk about, what percentage of, it would provide money up to a certain percentage, and it gives all those kind of specifics. So, that, nobody is promising that that's going to pass. I just want to be very clear about that. But that is something that's been in discussion, and there is a bill, and you can read the bill and see the kinds of things that they're proposing. And lobby your legislator, that's right. Yeah.
speaking to the comment earlier about the park improvements, which is a sort of public space, are there any initiatives to tag along with the designations to, say, improve like the street lighting? Like, for example, like in the Oakcroft, like the street lighting, just like, you know, the regular sort of city lighting. But if you go into, say, like Brooklyn Heights or something, there's like, you know, beautiful street lights. There's efforts made to, you know, improve sidewalks, things like that. Anything in tandem that would come along with this from the Montclair side?
And I think that that's certainly something that could be a future discussion. I think that this is kind of the first step that then would lead to those kinds of later discussion points once the district is established, should it be established by the council.
At least you have lights. The lights on my street have been out for 7 years. Because the wire, they come, they fix it, it's on for a week, and then it goes, there's something with the wire underneath. They can't figure it out. It's dangerous. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It seems like you have a lot of reading to do. And we hope to see you back on December 10th, correct? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And if you have, like I mentioned, the planning department is very accessible and open to any questions or concerns that if you may not be answered from the information that we've handed out. Okay.
Oh, the individual survey.